At 2 in the morning, I was wrenched out of sleep by a sound I will never forget. My daughter's scream wasn't the kind of cry that comes from a bad dream, the kind you soothe with a lullaby and a glass of water. This scream had an edge in it, sharp and jagged, as though terror itself had found its way into her chest and ripped its way out through her throat. I stumbled out of bed, heart pounding, bare feet cold against the floor, and I rushed down the hall toward her room. The house was quiet except for her voice, which pierced through the silence like broken glass. When I pushed open her bedroom door, the nightlight glowed faintly, casting her little body in pale orange. She was sitting up in bed, clutching her blanket so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her eyes were wide, glassy, darting around the room as though trying to follow something I couldn't see. And then she shouted a name, a man's name, a name I didn't recognize, never heard in our family, never spoken in our home. It tumbled out of her mouth in a voice so sure, so certain, that it froze me where I stood. I rushed to her, gathering her into my arms, whispering, "It's okay, sweetheart, it's okay." But her little body trembled against me, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. I kept stroking her hair, waiting for her sobs to soften, but the name lingered in my ears like a curse. I remember whispering it back to myself, trying to make sense of it. It didn't belong to anyone I knew. It didn't belong in our home. And yet it came from her lips as though she had known it all her life. That night, long after I had soothed her and tucked her back beneath the covers, I lay awake in my own bed, staring at the ceiling. My husband snored softly beside me, unbothered, while the name my daughter had cried out played in a loop inside my head. I told myself it had to be some fluke, some leftover from a television show or a storybook, something she'd overheard without me realizing. Children pick up words like seeds carried by the wind. But even as I tried to convince myself, the memory of her voice, piercing, desperate, filled with certainty, gnawed at me. And the truth was, it hadn't started that night. Weeks before, she had begun waking restless, twisting in her bedsheets, whispering about the man. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she whimpered, sometimes she pointed toward the dark corners of her room where the nightlight didn't reach. I laughed it off in those first moments, telling myself it was just nightmares, shadows, and an imagination too active for its own good. I'd tuck her back in, kiss her forehead, and tell her everything was fine. But children are not so easily dismissed. And as the night stacked up, the unease inside me grew. The next morning, when sunlight finally crept across the floorboards, I went into her room to make sense of it all. I expected to find nothing but toys, clothes, the scattered chaos of childhood. And mostly, that's what I saw. Dolls left in a circle, picture books piled on the nightstand, her teddy bear tossed carelessly on the floor. But in the corner of the window frame, near where the curtains brushed against the wood, I saw something that made my stomach clench. There, scratched faintly into the paint, was the name. The same name. At first, I thought it was my imagination, that my mind was twisting the lines into letters. But as I leaned closer, I saw the grooves, the deliberate strokes. The wood had been cut, shallow but purposeful. And though the letters were faint, they were unmistakable. The very name my daughter had screamed the night before. My skin prickled, heat rising up the back of my neck. How could it be there? She couldn't have carved it. She was only 4. She didn't know how to spell. And even if she did, she had no reason to carve it into her window frame. I backed away, heart hammering in my chest. And when I asked my husband if he'd noticed anything strange, he shook his head and told me I was overthinking it. He hadn't heard her scream, hadn't seen the scratches, hadn't been shaken awake in the middle of the night by our child trembling in terror. "Nightmares," he said dismissively, as if nightmares could carve names into wood. I tried to argue, but the words felt heavy on my tongue, weighed down by doubt. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew children don't invent names like that, not names that echo with history. Later that day, when the sun was high and the world felt safer, I mentioned the name casually to our neighbor, Mrs. Cooper. I expected nothing. I expected her to shrug, to tell me it was nonsense, to laugh it off the way my husband had. But instead, her face drained of color. She froze, her eyes widening as though I had just whispered a secret too dark to speak loud. She reached for the railing of her porch, steadying herself, and asked me to repeat it. When I did, her lips trembled. "That was the name of the man who used to live here," she said quietly. "The one who never came home." Her words struck me like a blow. I stood there, clutching my arms around myself as though to ward off a sudden chill, the air around me thick and heavy. I wanted to ask her more, but something in her voice told me she didn't want to say another word. She excused herself, slipping back into her house and closing the door behind her, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding in my ears. That evening, as the shadows stretched across the yard and the house grew quiet again, I remembered something from when we first moved in. I had walked from room to room, trying to convince myself the creaks in the floorboards were nothing unusual, that the stillness in the air was just the calm of a new beginning. But even then, I had felt it. That quiet had been too deep, too heavy, the kind of quiet that doesn't welcome you, but watches you. I ignored it then, brushed it aside with the excitement of fresh paint and unpacked boxes. But now I realize I should have listened. Because my daughter hadn't just cried out in the night. She had called him. And the house, I feared, had answered. That night, I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. After all, sleep deprivation can twist your thoughts, and I hadn't slept properly in weeks. My husband's reassurances echoed in my ears, but they rang hollow. He hadn't heard the scream. He hadn't stood in our daughter's room and felt the air crackle with something unseen. He didn't know the weight of that name on her lips, the way it seemed to cling to the walls. I lay awake, listening to every creak of the house, every sigh of the wind outside, and I told myself over and over that it was nothing, just shadows, just dreams, just an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew better. The following day, I couldn't stop myself from digging. I sat at the kitchen table, coffee going cold in my hands, whispering the name under my breath like a secret. My daughter played on the floor with her blocks, humming to herself, but every now and then she would glance toward the hallway, her eyes narrowing, as if expecting someone to appear. Each time she did, a shiver ran down my spine. Children see what we cannot, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just imagining, she was remembering. I spent hours searching my memory, trying to recall if I had ever heard the name before. Had it been in a storybook, a movie playing in the background, something from my own past that I'd forgotten? But no matter how hard I tried, it felt foreign, unfamiliar. And yet on my daughter's tongue, it sounded lived in, as though she'd known it long before she could even speak. That evening, when the house settled into its nighttime quiet, I asked her gently about the man she kept seeing. I didn't want to scare her, didn't want to feed her imagination, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. She was sitting on her bed, brushing the hair of her doll with slow, distracted strokes. I sat beside her, smoothing the blanket with my hand, and asked, "Sweetheart, can you tell me about the man?" Her brush froze. Slowly, she turned to me, her big eyes solemn, too solemn for a child her age. She whispered his name, so soft I could barely hear it. And then she said, "He stands in the corner, Mommy, right there." She pointed to the darkest part of the room, the shadowed space where the night light's glow didn't reach. My skin prickled, and I forced myself to look, but of course there was nothing there. Nothing I could see. I smiled for her sake, kissed her forehead, and told her everything would be fine. But when I left her room, I lingered in the hallway, staring back at that corner. The air there seemed thicker, heavier, as though it clung to itself. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. The name echoed in my mind over and over, like a warning I didn't yet understand. The following morning, curiosity gnawed at me until I couldn't resist. I went to the library, telling my husband I needed a break. The building smelled of dust and old paper, the kind of place where secrets linger in forgotten corners. I sat at a computer, typed the name into the archives, and waited. At first, nothing. And then there it was, an old newspaper article, dated nearly 10 years back. The man with that name had lived in our very house. He had been seen leaving a bar late one night not far from here. He never made it home. Missing, presumed dead, but his body was never found. I stared at the words on the screen until my eyes blurred. A chill crawled down my arms as I realized my daughter had been crying out for someone who had vanished years before she was even born. Someone who had walked the same halls we now walked. Someone who had called this place home and perhaps never truly left. When I returned home, I didn't know how to tell my husband. He barely tolerated my unease as it was, and if I showed him an old newspaper clipping, he would shake his head and call me dramatic. So I kept it to myself, though the weight of it pressed heavily on my chest. That night, my daughter woke again, but this time she didn't scream, she whispered. I woke to the sound of her tiny voice drifting down the hall, soft and steady. I slipped out of bed and padded toward her room, my heart hammering against my ribs. As I stood in the doorway, I heard her say it. "He's cold, Mommy." The words sliced through me. She wasn't calling his name this time. She wasn't crying or trembling. She was speaking with calm certainty, like someone describing the weather. "He's cold." My breath caught in my throat and I stepped inside, my voice trembling as I asked, "Sweetheart, who's cold?" She turned her head toward me, her eyes glassy with sleep, and whispered the name. Then she lay back down, her eyelids fluttering shut as though she'd never spoken at all. I stood there in the glow of the nightlight, my body rigid, the silence pressing in on me. I wanted to shake her awake, to demand she tell me more, but she was already breathing evenly, lost in dreams, or perhaps not dreams at all. The following days blurred together, a haze of unease that clung to every moment. I tried to go about my routines, laundry, groceries, playtime, but the name followed me everywhere. I heard it in the scrape of the wind against the windows, in the rhythm of footsteps on the sidewalk, in the low hum of the refrigerator. It lived in the walls, in the floorboards, in the corners of every room. And then came the discovery that made denial impossible. Contractors had come to inspect the basement. We had been planning renovations, nothing major, just repairs to old vents and cracked cement. I busied myself upstairs, trying not to think about what might be lurking in the shadows below. Then one of the men called up to me. His voice was tight, uneasy. I went down into the basement, the air damp and cool, the smell of mildew heavy in my nose. The contractor held something in his hand, wrapped in a rag, as though he didn't want to touch it directly. He unfolded the cloth, and there it was. A worn leather wallet, edges frayed, the surface darkened with age. Inside, an identification card, the name staring up at me in faded print. The very same name my daughter had been whispering in the night. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, my knees weak, my breath shallow. It wasn't just a nightmare. It wasn't just a child's imagination. There was proof, tangible and undeniable, pulled from the very bones of our home. The man had been here. He had left behind pieces of himself, waiting to be found. I stared at the wallet, bile rising in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. It felt wrong, as though it still belonged to him, as though he had been keeping it safe all this time. The contractor muttered something about calling the authorities, and I nodded numbly, my mind whirling. When the police arrived, their faces hardened the moment they saw the ID. They knew the case. They remembered the man who had vanished a decade ago. Their questions blurred together in my ears. How did I find this? How long had we lived here? Had I noticed anything strange? I answered mechanically, my voice thin, my body trembling. I didn't tell them about my daughter. I couldn't. Not yet. How could I explain that a 4-year-old child had spoken his name before we ever uncovered his wallet? That night, after the police left, the house felt heavier than ever. My daughter slept soundly, but I couldn't close my eyes. I sat in the living room, staring into the dark, listening to every creak, every sigh of the walls. My husband tried to reassure me, his hand warm on mine, but even his presence couldn't dispel the chill that had settled into my bones. Because now I knew. My daughter hadn't invented anything. She hadn't been dreaming. She had been speaking to someone who had lived, who had suffered, who had disappeared into the shadows of this very street. And he wasn't finished. The night after the police left was the longest of my life. I lay in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing down like a weight. Every sound became suspicious. The ticking of the clock, the groan of the pipes, the subtle sigh of the wind through the eaves. My husband slept beside me, his breaths steady and oblivious. But I couldn't follow him into that safe place. My mind was too alert, too raw, waiting for something, though I couldn't have said what. But now I knew. When the house finally fell into the deepest silence, I thought perhaps I might drift into sleep after all. And then, as if on cue, a sound reached me. It was faint at first, a whisper of movement, like the brushing of fabric against the floor. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. I strained to listen. There it was again. This time, a step. Then another, soft, deliberate, moving down the hall toward my daughter's room. I didn't think. I threw back the blankets and rushed out, my feet slapping the cold floor. The hall was dark, the nightlight in her room casting a weak glow that spilled just barely across the threshold. I held my breath, heart hammering, as I pushed open her door. She was sitting up again. Not screaming, not crying, but wide awake, her little hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes were fixed on that same shadowed corner, the one she always pointed to, the one that seemed heavier than the rest of the room. When she heard me, she turned her head slowly, as if it cost her something to look away. Her lips parted, and she whispered his name. Then she added, with a calmness that chilled me to the bone, "He's standing right behind you, Mommy." I spun around, my breath catching, my body trembling, but there was nothing. Just the hallway stretching empty behind me, the faint glow of another nightlight from the bathroom flickering against the wall. Nothing but silence. And yet, my skin prickled, my throat went dry, and every instinct in my body screamed that someone was there. I gathered her in my arms, clutching her so tightly she whimpered, and carried her into my own room. My husband stirred, mumbling in confusion, but I ignored him, laying her down between us and keeping one arm around her. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I stared into the dark until the first gray light of dawn crept through the blinds, every muscle in my body taut with dread. The next morning, I finally confessed everything to my husband. The screams, the name, the scratched letters, the neighbor's pale face, the article in the archives, the whisper of, "He's cold, Mommy," and the wallet pulled from our basement. He listened, his expression shifting from confusion to irritation to disbelief. When I finished, his silence cut deeper than any words could. "You're scaring yourself," he said at last, his voice firm, the tone of a man trying to anchor himself in reason. "You're letting a child's imagination get into your head. She's 4. 4-year-olds say strange things. You're taking it too far." But I saw the flicker in his eyes, the hesitation he tried to bury. He wasn't entirely sure, no matter how he tried to sound. He didn't go into the basement. He didn't ask to see the scratches on the window frame. He avoided the very corners of the story that gnawed at me most. That evening, I couldn't sit still. I paced the living room, staring out at the street where the missing man had once walked, imagining him turning down this very block, steps echoing in the night before he disappeared. I couldn't help but feel the house was a trap, a place where things didn't end cleanly, where the past sunk its claws into the present and refused to let go. When my daughter fell asleep again, I sat by her bed, unwilling to leave her side. I watched her chest rise and fall, her lashes flutter against her cheeks, her little hand curled around her doll. Hours passed in silence. Then, just as I began to relax, her lips moved. At first, I thought she was dreaming, murmuring nonsense. But then I leaned closer, and I heard it. She whispered, "He's waiting in the woods." The words made my blood run cold. I pulled back, staring at her, willing her to open her eyes, but she slept on, peaceful, oblivious to the terror she just planted in me. The next day, I couldn't fight it anymore. I went back to the police station. I showed them the clipping I'd printed from the library, told them what my neighbor had said, told them the man had been last seen near our street. I left out my daughter again. I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud, but I urged them to look deeper, to search the woods. The officer who listened to me grew very quiet. His eyes, steady and watchful, didn't leave my face. Finally, he said, "We've searched those woods before. We found nothing." But there was a hesitation in his voice, as if he didn't believe his own words anymore, as if he knew something was still unfinished. They promised to review the case again. Promises are easy. What weighed heavier was the look they gave me when I mentioned the basement, the way their jaws tightened, their voices clipped. They knew the story. They hadn't forgotten. That night, my daughter woke once more, but this time her eyes weren't wide with fear. They were calm, too calm. She sat up, looked at me with an expression almost too old for her face, and said, "He's coming back, Mommy." I froze. My throat closed. My hands trembled. "Who's coming back, sweetheart?" I asked, barely managing to keep my voice steady. She tilted her head, blinked slowly, and whispered his name. The silence that followed pressed in around us, thick and suffocating. I felt as though I was standing on the edge of something vast, something dark, something I couldn't see but knew was waiting for me. My daughter lay back down, drifting into sleep as easily as if she hadn't just spoken the words that would haunt me forever. I sat awake until dawn, staring at the shadows, waiting for a shape to emerge, for a sound to confirm what I already feared, that we were no longer alone in this house, if we ever had been. When the police called later that week to tell me they were reopening the case, I wasn't surprised. The discovery of the wallet had been enough, but I could tell from their voices that something else was stirring, something they didn't want to say yet. I asked them if they would be searching the woods. The line went quiet for a long moment before the officer finally said yes. I hung up the phone with hands that shook so badly I nearly dropped it. My daughter was playing in the living room, stacking blocks with innocent concentration, her little tongue poking out at the corner of her mouth. She looked so normal, so untouched, but I couldn't unsee the weight of her words, the way her young voice carried truths she should never have known. And I realized with a hollow certainty that the man who had vanished a decade ago had never truly left. His story was tangled up in ours now. My daughter had become his voice, his echo, his tether, and I was powerless to cut it. The night before the police returned to search the woods, I barely slept. I sat in the living room with every light on, my daughter's blanket wrapped around my shoulders, the silence of the house pressing in on me like a secret it didn't want to share. My husband, frustrated with my restless pacing, had gone to bed hours earlier, muttering that I was letting this whole thing consume me. Maybe he was right. But when I looked at my daughter, when I remembered the certainty in her voice, I knew there was no way to dismiss it. Children don't carry the weight of grief that belongs to strangers, not unless that grief finds a way to speak through them. When dawn broke, pale and gray, I dressed my daughter for school, her small body warm and soft in my hands. She looked up at me with sleepy eyes and asked, "Will they find him, Mommy?" The words slipped from her so casually, as though she were asking about a misplaced toy. My throat closed, but I nodded, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "Maybe, sweetheart. Maybe they will." After I dropped her off, I drove past the edge of the woods. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches intertwined like fingers clutching secrets. The ground was littered with last year's leaves, brittle and brown, crunching beneath the tires as I slowed to a crawl. I imagined him walking here, all those years ago, leaving the bar with the night heavy on his shoulders, the shadows swallowing him whole. Did he know in those final steps that he would never leave these woods again? Or did it come suddenly? A blow, a struggle, a silence that erased him from the world? The police arrived in the afternoon, their cars lined up along the street, their radios crackling with clipped voices. Neighbors gathered, whispering behind hands, their eyes darting between me and the trees. I stayed on the porch, arms wrapped tightly around myself, as the officers disappeared into the shadows with dogs and flashlights. The hours stretched long, the sun crawling across the sky, sinking lower and lower until the woods seemed to swallow the light whole. When they returned at dusk, their faces were grave. They didn't have to speak. I saw it in their eyes, the heaviness of what they carried. They had found something. I wanted to ask, but my lips wouldn't move. My voice wouldn't come. All I could do was stand there, numb, as they spoke quietly to one another, their words lost on the wind. That night, after they left, my daughter climbed into my lap while I sat on the couch, staring at nothing. She tucked her head beneath my chin, her tiny hands curling into my shirt, and whispered, "He's not cold anymore." I froze, tears stinging my eyes, my body trembling as though the words themselves had pierced me. I held her tighter, pressing my lips to the crown of her head, tasting salt on my lips that wasn't hers, but mine. She had no way of knowing what they'd found. No one had spoken in front of her, and yet she knew. She always knew. Days passed, and the house no longer felt the same. The silence was still there, but it wasn't heavy in the same way. It was a silence that exhaled, a silence that had finally let go of something it had been clutching for too long. But though the weight had shifted, it hadn't vanished. Something remained, a shadow just out of sight, waiting. The police returned often in those days, asking more questions, piecing together fragments of a life cut short. They spoke of closure, of long-lost families finally given answers. They spoke of justice, though they admitted it might never come. But in the quiet moments, when I sat with my daughter, I wondered if closure was ever truly possible. You can bury a body, you can put a name on a stone, but how do you bury the echoes that linger in the corners of a child's room? My daughter hasn't stopped speaking his name. It comes less often now, a whisper in the dark, a murmur as she drifts into sleep. But every time she does, my heart tightens because I don't know if she's remembering him or if he's still there, standing in that shadowed corner, tethered to us by something stronger than death. Sometimes, when I walk through the house alone, I pause at the window where his name was carved. I trace the grooves with my fingers, faint and shallow but real. I imagine him standing there, carving those letters with shaking hands, leaving behind a mark not meant to be found until years later. I wonder if he knew someone would come after him, someone who would hear his name through the lips of a child who had never met him. There are nights when I lie awake, listening, waiting. I don't hear footsteps anymore, not like before. But sometimes I feel it, the shift in the air, the prickle at the back of my neck, the sense of being watched. I tell myself it's nothing, that he's gone now, that whatever tether bound him here has finally loosened. But then I think of my daughter's voice, soft and sure, whispering things she couldn't possibly know. The other night, as I tucked her into bed, she looked up at me with eyes too old for her small face and said, "He doesn't want to leave you yet." My stomach dropped, my hands trembling as I smoothed her blanket. I forced a smile, kissed her forehead, and whispered goodnight. But when I stepped into the hallway, my knees gave out, and I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. Because if he doesn't want to leave, then he won't. And I know now that this story doesn't have an end. It isn't something I can fold up neatly and tuck away. It lingers in the walls, in the floorboards, in the soft breath of my daughter as she sleeps. It lingers in me. Maybe the case has been reopened. Maybe the Woods have given up their secrets. Maybe the police will write their reports and close their files and call it solved. But for me, for my daughter, it's only just beginning. Because every time she closes her eyes, every time she stirs in the night, I wait for her voice. And I know sooner or later, she will whisper something new. And I am terrified of what she'll say next.